45, 50 minutes, yeah, it's pretty much the whole time. All right, sorry for the technical difficulties. We're having a little issue with the interface for the slides. So you'll get to see the slides here. They won't be in the talk on the first round online. I'll have to send them to Adrian. He'll add them later on. So here we go. My name is Jim Niederauer. Thanks for coming today. So how's DerbyCon treating you? Like it so far? All right, now it's like getting to be close to 5 o'clock on Saturday. I need a little more than that. Come on, get a little excited now. It's the weekend, right? All right. So I'm a senior security specialist at AppRiver. Before we get started, I'm going to go over the standard disclosures. You can all read that and agree to that. There's nothing in this talk that's going to give you any insight into how to break things or do any damage to anybody. So first, a little about me. I've been with AppRiver for over 10 years. I've started 2 different IT companies. I've spoken at a multitude of InfoSec events. I've been at NobleCon this year. I had the pleasure of speaking at DEF CON, so that was quite an experience. Imagine a room with 3,600 people in it. That was quite fun. I'm on staff at B-Sides Las Vegas, the president of the Florida Panhandle chapter of ISC Squared. Today's talk is a little bit different than most talks that I give. Usually I get pretty technical and I like people to walk away with an idea of how to better secure their networks. One of the topics that's been coming up in the Twitter feeds and things like that are people talking about having degrees in InfoSec, not having degrees in InfoSec. Do I need a degree? Do I not need a degree? You suck because you have a degree. You're no good because you don't have a degree. That's all flying around, right? So I'm going to talk about one person's experience, my experience, how I got from where I started to where I am today. And maybe you can see that not every path has to be the same. It's a matter of where we're going and not how we get there sometimes. There's also not going to be a lot of words on my slides. So sit back, relax, take a trip with me down memory lane as I go through some of the milestones in my career in transitioning from a microbiologist into the field of InfoSec. So you might ask, why did I come up with this talk? Been reading a lot of Kevin Mitnick's books lately. I got to meet him at RSA conference. I've seen him at a couple different conferences around. One of the books he has out is called The Art of Deception. Anybody have any idea what year that book was written?
95.
Close, 2002, 15 years ago. So as I was reading that book, he was going over a lot of the same things that we're seeing happen today. The very thing that happened with Equifax, not patching your systems. The very things we're seeing with social engineering. A book written 15 years ago, and we're still making the same mistakes. When I was looking through this, I looked at a quote by George Santayana. It says, in his writing, he says, when experience is not retained as among savages, infancy is perpetual. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So I'm a bit older than most of you guys here. So I've got a little bit more experience from back when, before the internet. I was around before the internet, okay? That's how far back I go. So today's slides are gonna not be too many words, but basically what happened was I grew up kind of like this guy. I lived on a farm in Pennsylvania. I spent my time hunting, fishing, and my goal was to go to veterinary school. So I picked out a college to where I could get prepared to get into veterinary school. I knew what I needed to do, wanted to get there. So I took a shot at it. What came out of the ground was not exactly what I expected. So Rod Sterling said there's a 5th dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It's the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. It lies between the pit of a man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of our imagination. It's an area in which we call the twilight zone. So the twilight zone is our imagination. What can we imagine happening? Well, my introduction to computer technology happened in high school. Anybody know what this thing is? What it's called? There's a name for it, though. Begins with an H. It's a Hollerith card, named for the code that was invented in 1896, I believe, for encoding digits in rows and columns by holes in paper. But in any case, these are 80 characters per card. Now, when we programmed, this is what we programmed in first. We would get a machine, we would sit there and we would type in our program, it would generate these punch cards. We would run this punch card over to a stack reader. That stack reader would then read all of these cards and run the program. Now, can you imagine debugging this? Just for reference, a single 16 gig micro SD card holds 199,993 99,433 of these cards. That's 99,000 boxes of 2,000. So when we do programming, if you were to make a mistake, let's say you had 1,000 of these cards. You notice something that's missing from these cards? There's no number. You don't know where they fit in the stack, right? So you're walking down the hallway, somebody bumps into you, knocks these cards out of your hand. What do? You got to go reprint the whole stack. You get halfway through a program, there's something off by a byte. You got to reprint everything below that to run it through the machine. So this is where I started. This was why I didn't want to get into computers when I started in the field, when I started looking for a career field. So this is the machine that we would use to type up these cards. It's got a key punch, and the cards would slide on through, and it would put the program onto the cards. They would come out on the other side in a stack. Then you would carry them over to the computer. It would read through a stack reader and then load the program into the computer. So we got lucky at our school. How many remember these computers? The Trash 80 computers, right? From Radio Shack or Tandy Corporation. Our school got lucky. We had these things in our school, and this is the first thing I learned to program on. There was this little company out of New Mexico that created this language called BASIC. BASIC Level 1, BASIC Level 2. Anybody know the company? Nobody knows that company. You all know that company, and you hate their guts. It was Microsoft. That was the first product that they ever developed. They developed Pascal first. Bill Gates wrote the compiler for BASIC Level 1 and Level 2. The third release of BASIC was Disk Basic. So these computers did not have disks at the time. The ones we had at our high school, we stored our programs on cassette tapes. The cassette tapes were labeled with our name, put in a plastic box, and put on a shelf. That was our security. That's how we stored our programs. Along came later the 5 1/4 inch disc. Those discs held, anybody want to guess? They held 85 kilobytes of data, the first release. The computer itself only had 48K of memory. Now, think about that. You can only write a program, including everything else that's running in memory, has to be smaller than 48K to be able to run. Anybody out there can do that today? Probably not, right? You had to program very elegantly. So, later on in that year, in 1981, a little company called IBM undertook a project called the Project Chess. And this was back before PCs were on the market. People at IBM went and they talked with Bill Gates about licensing their programming languages, but they also didn't have an operating system. They had worked with several different companies. There was a company called Digital Research that had developed an operating system that was used on the Tandy machines, but they didn't want to use that because of the cost factor. IBM was going to try and get this to market so it was a consumer grade so a lot of people could buy it. So they met with Bill Gates and kept asking for an operating system. Bill Gates kept referring him to a company called Digital Research. Digital Research had a product called CP/M. A guy named Gary Kildall, think of that name, Kildall, worked with IBM, and he was the guy that was at Digital Research. IBM offered them a non-disclosure agreement to use their DOS product on the IBM PC. Kildall said, no, I don't like the agreement. IBM walked away. Paul Allen worked with Bill Gates, and they came across this guy named Tim Patterson. He had built a very rudimentary 8086-based computer and written the first DOS-based program. First DOS-based was called QDOS. Anybody know what that stands for? Bingo, Quick and Dirty OS. That was the first version of DOS ever written. Allen made an agreement with him to pay him and his company, SCP, $15,000 for every licensed copy of QDOS, plus a $10,000 commission for every other company they sold it to. Within a couple of years, Allen had gone to him. He had come over to Microsoft and bought all of DOS for $50,000. They sold their first round to IBM for $460,000, and the rest is history. That put IBM out of business because when IBM sold, or not IBM, it put Tandy out of business because when they sold these computers, they were able to sell DOS for about $40. The other operating system sold for $240, so there was no way for Tandy to compete. In my college days, we ended up doing some programming, and I took a minor in computer programming while I was working on a degree in biology. And we had to work on these fine machines. Anybody know what this is? VAX 1170, right? So these are mainframe computers. Everything was stored locally. You had terminals that you would connect to. We programmed in our classes. We had classes in Fortran and Pascal. Anybody ever program in Fortran? Pain in the ass, isn't it? Fortran is a formatted, meaning a column formatted language. So your lines, your line numbers, certain characters had to be in column 2, certain in 3, certain in 4, and certain in 5. And if you're off by one character in any of that compile, you had to rerun all of your code, recompile. It was kind of really a pain in the butt to work with. But it was a fun, strictly formatted language. So I also got lucky, and the biology department where I was going to school had a couple of these fine little devices. These are, this is an Apple IIe, I believe. These devices, they had them in there for teaching. The teachers were supposed to use them as a way to quiz students and help them grow in learning biology. Well, our teachers had them. They didn't know what the heck to do with them. So they handed them off to the college students, me at the time, young, and the young people had to teach the teachers how to use the computers. So that was part of my exposure there as well. So while that was going on, I'm studying to get my degree in biology, applying to veterinary school, doing all the things I need to do to follow that path. In the meantime, there's this guy named Michael Dell. He was taking a different approach at UT in Austin. He started putting together computers in his dorm room and selling them. Within 2 years, he went from selling them out of his dorm room to an 82,000 square foot warehouse and factory in Austin, Texas. During that time, several other competitors came into the market. Compaq was probably the first one to offer PCs, but their initial focus was on suitcase computers. And I'll show you one of those here coming up, as I used one of those during some time later in my graduate studies. But during this time, Dell was the main leader, and that Gateway came along shortly thereafter. Hewlett-Packard had always sold PCs, but never in the consumer market. And then Packard Bell came along later, and that brought about the proliferation of PCs in the consumer market. Now, the internet wasn't a thing in 1980. Nobody knew what the internet was, right? You had BBS services. CompuServe had been around, I think, since 1969. If you bought, like, who remembers a Timex Sinclair computer, right? That was one of the first ones out there. Or the Commodore 64. I think they actually had a Commodore 32 before that. Didn't go very far, but they all came with CompuServe and a couple other BBS services that you could actually dial into and use. The problem with those services was most small towns didn't have local phone numbers to dial into. So young people today don't understand what long distance is, right? When we grew up, you had a local number that you could dial, you had an extended local number, which was called a LATA, and then you had long distance calls that you could make. Anything in your local exchange was a free call. You would pay a little extra for calls within that LATA and a lot more per minute when you made long distance calls. So if you had to dial, say, CompuServe, and they're not in your town, you could rack up hundreds of dollars a month in long distance charges just because you're online dialing these things. So in 1980, the connection to the computer network protocols wasn't around, but the idea behind the Ethernet protocol was developed by a man named, anybody know? Robert Metcalfe. There's another old guy in the room. Robert Metcalfe developed that. He worked with David Boggs, Chuck Thacker, Butler Lampson, and another fellow at Xerox PARC. And a side story, the Xerox PARC, anybody know what else that's famous for? Who else went there and stole some ideas and built a computer that I showed you 2 slides earlier, right? Xerox PARC is where that was developed. It was in a basement warehouse, and they showed them this mouse and a graphical screen, and from there they went on and built the Apple computer. So Xerox Corporation was central in the development of a lot of these technologies, but they really weren't the winner in the market share. So 3Com worked. Metcalfe left Xerox in 1979 to form a company called 3Com. This was the first networking company. They worked with DEC, Intel, and Xerox to promote the first Ethernet standard in 1980, and they published a paper on that. In 1983, it was adapted as the Ethernet protocol, or the Ethernet standard that we know of as the 802.3, and that was in 1983. So who knows what the first formal standard was called in that paper that they published? It's called DICS, for Digital Equipment Corporation, IBM, and Xerox. So the internet was founded on a bunch of dicks. I thought that was funny. But 1984, another little player came into the game, and their initial logo is down there in the bottom. That was the Cisco Corporation. They were founded in San Francisco, California. So the Ethernet was originally token ring or token bus done over thin net cable or thick net cable with BNC connectors. After that, in 1981, the first 10 megabit Ethernet card became available. They were mostly used on servers at that time, like the VAX, those kinds of systems. And PCs were able to get network cards in 1982. And the market share grew a little bit at that point in time. And my mouse is gone. There it is. So Ethernet on untwisted pair cable, like what we use today, started out with a star LAN. It started out as 1 megabit per second in the mid-1980s. And in 1987, Synoptics introduced the first twisted pair Ethernet cable at 10 megabits, and they created a star topology with a centralized hub. And that's when Ethernet, as we know it today, started to become proliferated in the marketplace. And that's where it became affordable for small businesses to start networking their devices. So this standard was published in 1984. Anybody know what it is? Everybody in this room should know what it is, but if when I tell you, you'll know what it is. This is the standard for the Open System Interconnect model, or the OSI model. This was ratified in 1984. Without this, networking protocols wouldn't work. Things wouldn't be able to talk to one another, right? And there's what that is. So in 1985, I finished with my degree in biology, and I moved to this town. I didn't get accepted into veterinary school. Veterinary school is very difficult to get into. It's much like medical school, only harder. There were at the time only 24 schools in the country. They accepted about 100 students, but you had to have strict residency requirements. So in my case, I lived in Pennsylvania. There were really only 3 schools I could apply to. 2 of them were Ivy League, and 3.5 grade at point average wasn't quite good enough. So I decided to move to where I could make some money at a job. A friend of mine told me about a job in Las Vegas. I went out there and worked and applied to graduate school. While I was out there, this is just an interesting picture. I don't know if you can see. This picture is actually from 1985. Wrong button. There we go. Right here, that hotel, that's Bally's, where DEF CON was, not this year, but last year. This is 1985. This whole area here is where Mandalay Bay is. This is where the new MGM is. So you can see Las Vegas was quite different in 1985 when I lived there. It was easy to get across the strip at that point in life. So I worked out there. I worked for a laboratory called Lockheed. We worked on the EPA's National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program, where we ran a lab out there and took samples in and shipped them off to other labs. In the meantime, I applied to graduate schools, got accepted to a bunch of them. I went to this one because they had a good football team and they gave me the most money. So now that's how kids make choices, right? Went there and worked for 3 years in the microbiology department. But during that time, I had to write a thesis, a master's degree. This was a research thesis, so I had to put that together. When I was there writing my thesis, this was my best friend. How many of you have ever tried to type up a paper on a typewriter? Yeah. How many liked that experience? And can you imagine doing a blog post every day on a typewriter and having to submit it, right? So this thing became my best friend. This, I believe it was a compact computer. The screen on it was like 9 inches or something. But it was great for me because I could sit there and type up my thesis, and it basically you put the disk in one side and you put your storage of where you're putting your files on the other. You ran WordPerfect off the floppy disk. It loaded in memory. You typed up your paper, saved it. And I would take an extra copy with me because I was paranoid. I didn't want to lose the disk. I didn't trust them. These were kind of new, and I didn't know, what could happen to them. Discs are very sensitive compared to CDs. So I worked there until 1989. 1991, they published some of my research in this FEMS Journal of Microbiology. I've got several other publications out there. In 1989, I went on to a summer job in Washington, D.C. area, and then later that year, I got transferred to this location, the U.S. EPA in Gulf Breeze, Florida. Anybody know what this is a picture of? Yeah, Exxon Valdez oil spill, right? That happened in March of 1989. Second largest oil spill in the continental United States ever. But, here's a question for you. You know how many captains it takes to steer the Exxon Valdez through the Prince William Sound? 1 1/5. That's what the EPA does for you, right? You learn all these great things. So the laboratory where I was working was doing some environmental studies on this. They had been up there doing work before I came down to the laboratory. The laboratory was studying how bacteria degrade components of crude oil. So they would do really rudimentary experiments. They would take a patch of beach, divide it into sections with markers, put basically fertilizer on one side, leave the other side alone, and measure it over time to see how the bacteria destroy the oil. Because the other way they were cleaning it up, if you knew, they were taking paper towels and wiping the rocks by hand, putting the paper towels in plastic bags and shipping them to a landfill in Oregon. So that was really environmentally friendly. But anyway, the EPA is not always the smartest tools in the shed. So this picture taken from Sabine Island. This is near where Dave Kennedy went to school. I was in the Marine Corps for a little while, Corey Station near NAS Pensacola. But this island's kind of interesting because, this is an aside, it wasn't a natural island. From about the mid-1850s until the early 1920s, ships would come over from Europe. Well, those ships would come over empty. When the ships come over empty, they have to have ballast rock to keep the ship upright and low in the water so it can make the trip. But when they get here, then they have to dump that ballast rock somewhere and fill up with cargo and go back. So this was the dumping ground for all of the ballast, and it became Sabine Island. Really cool place. We used to go snorkeling around the island, do all kinds of fun stuff there. But I came to the party too late. I was working with a couple of guys that were doing a little bit more genetic research. My background was in molecular biology at the time. And we were studying how bacteria, the metabolic pathways for how bacteria degraded two different compounds, one isopropyl benzene, and this fun little compound is called benzothiophene. It's a heterocyclic organic compound. It's called heterocyclic because it's not all carbons. It has a sulfur in it, and it's one of the components of crude oil. So what we would do is we would take bacteria that could eat this stuff, live off of it. We would break up their genes and find ones that accumulated intermediates in the metabolism of this, and then study how that worked. So through that, we would learn, for me, I learned the scientific method and the approach to figuring things out, right? So it's no different than hunting threats, right? It's no different than troubleshooting a network. It's really scientific methodology applied to a different setting. Uh-oh. We were just talking about you. So what is this? Zebra. Zebra, cool. Let me take the enamel off my teeth. Thank you, sir. Yeah. I'll be up front. I'm not going to drink this whole thing. This tastes like a shitty Bartles and James. Ugh. Woo! So, back to microbiology. This is where I really started to get into computers. And you think, well, computers. Well, what do you use computers for besides going on the internet, browsing whatever you browse, and hacking things, right? Well, there's a whole lot more than that. In our case, we were using all of these different devices to do our work. So we would accumulate all of these different intermediates in these metabolic pathways, but we had to be able to figure out what they were. So we would use things like, this is a spectrophotometer here, this is a gas chromatograph, the other one over there I think is a mass spectrometer, this guy down here is a nuclear magnetic resonance spectrophotometer, and this is a high-performance liquid chromatograph. But all of them were connected to computers. And in this case, HP had the market cornered on those. These were all HP computers with specialized interfaces that read data from these different devices, and we could then use that data to draw our conclusions based on what we were trying to study. So, towards the end of my career, the EPA got very anal. I worked as a contractor to the EPA, and we were working in the same lab as EPA employees. Well, in come the lawyers. The lawyers said, "Ooh, you can't do that. You can't have non-EPA employees in the same room with EPA people." So anyway, it became a big stink. Really turned me off about research. They wanted to keep me around. We had collected all of these, what we call in microbiology, clones. They're bacteria that have different genetic abilities. So they're like a bacterial species, subspecies, and then they're a strain that has a particular gene in them. Well, the lab had collected thousands of these different clones, and we had no way to keep track of them. So they came to me and said, well, we like you, want to keep you around. Can you create a database for us to put all this stuff in and keep track of it? So that was my first real introduction into computers and computer programming. They gave me a PC, this crazy Windows 3.1 operating system, which I had no clue how to use, and got me Paradox for Windows. So they said, put something together. So they stuck me in a room, and I learned how to use Windows. I learned how to use Paradox. I learned how to use databases. The cool thing was Paradox is a language called PAL, or I think it's Paradox Application Language, and the Windows version has something called ObjectPal, which is really cool language. Just a little history. The guy that developed the language in Paradox and then went on to create Delphi, anybody know where he works now? No, he works for Microsoft, and he's the lead programmer on the C# project. So that's where he started. I think his name's Niels Borsland. It's a Norwegian name, and I don't remember his name exactly, but that's where you got to start, was doing this programming or developing these systems here for Borland. So anyway, I ended up working alone, developing databases, graphical interfaces, worked with researchers, tried to make all this happen. At the same time, as I saw the writing on the wall, I was applying to PhD programs. I applied to Clemson, I applied to University of Illinois and University of Maryland. Got accepted at all of them. Then the EPA came back to me and said, well, we want you to come work for us. Now, at the time, I had a master's degree, and I was probably a GS 11 plus, somewhere up in there. They came back and offered me a 7 salary. So I told them to read between the lines and basically said, no, I'm not going to do that. But what ended up happening for me was that was a defining moment for me. I really realized that people didn't value scientific research. They valued their position, their esteem, and all that sort of thing. So I saw that I had this new thing, this new skill. I could use Windows. I could use a computer. I knew more about PCs than 100 people around me that had PhDs. So I took that and started doing some programming on the side for people, bought my own PC, stayed with them a little while. They put me on a postdoctorate fellowship for a while. Don't ask me why. They just said, we want you to stay. Put me in this postdoctoral position, which lasted 18 months. At the end of that 18 months, they basically said, yeah, we want you to stay, but now you have to go manage these people in this analytical chemistry lab. We had this one lab that the EPA employees had used to do PCB analysis over a very long period of time. And let's just say they were quite sloppy in how they did that. They used, I think there were 10 gas chromatographs in that room, all vented into the room. So the way a gas chromatograph works is you dissolve something in a solvent, inject it into this big coil, it goes through this oven. The coil has a substrate on it that separates out the compounds as they go along this coil, and as they come out on the other end, you read what comes out at various times. The problem is everything comes out and gets vented into the room, right? So then the solvents go away, and now you have a room full of PCB that's everywhere in the room, on the hoods, on the ceiling, on the cabinets, everywhere else. So they came to me and said, we want you to go work in there with these 3 women, 2 of which were pregnant. I said, I don't want to go work in there. I said, you have to. I said, no, I don't have to. I quit. So I ended up quitting the job, ventured out on my own, started doing some programming, bought a PC at home, and that's a paper that was published while I was at the EPA. Started getting involved in IT. One of the things I did was I opened up a remote backup service. People in our area wanted to keep their data, right? They had PCs, they had accounting programs, real simple stuff, but they had nowhere to store their data. So I bought into this remote backup program and did a bunch of odds and ends at my office to make that happen. Put in 4 phone lines, built a server. I'll go over how I did that in a second. But during my last years at the EPA, this internet thing became a big deal as well. So I saw the writing on the wall, and I made the choice to completely get away from science. I know I had a lot invested in my degree. I still had debt to pay. I still had student loans to pay off, but took a chance, went out on my own. Started doing all of this work. And at this point, the dial-up internet service business started taking off. Who remembers dial-up? Yeah, you would pay a certain fee and have X number of hours per month. Most of you don't know dial-up when you had to go by the hour, right? So you would get a subscription. In our area, it was Gulf Coast Internet. They were the internet provider in the area. It was like $14.95 a month, and I think they gave you 8 hours a month. Can you imagine being on the internet for 8 hours a month? So you would compose your emails offline, save them into your outbox, connect, click a button, and it would send your messages, and then you would get offline. Because if you went over that, it was, some ridiculous $2 or $3 an hour for the time that you were over on that time. Well, the internet business was interesting to me because it was really growing, and I thought, well, I could get in on this, I could do this. Then I started looking at the business model. Who remembers what happened during that time frame, right? What was the first modem speed that you remember working on the internet? 14.4, right? 9600, 14.4, that was pretty much typical speed. Well, within 3 years, what was the final speed? 56K, right? So now imagine yourself being an ISP. When you're an ISP, you would buy PRI lines incoming for your phone lines. So you would have 24 lines in a stack. So one PRI is 24 lines, 48, et cetera. So each one of those lines needs a modem coming in to answer that phone line. Well, those modems ran about $5,000 for a rack of 24. Now imagine that you bought that equipment, you're expecting to get a 3-year return on that equipment investment. But then suddenly the speed changes, and there's not a firmware upgrade to make that speed work. It's a swap the box, throw the box away, and put another box in the rack. Another 3 months goes by, and oh my God, there's a faster version, right? So this happened several times to the ISPs. Top that off with what happened in the industry. So the ISPs were making money, right? So their model works like this. A phone line would support typically 10 to 12 users. Each of those, let's say they're paying 15, we're gonna go use 20. So they're gonna go 10 at $20. They're making $200 a month on each line. Their expenses might be $120. So they're making $80 profit, add in the overages, it's a good business model. Well, these guys in the lower left, what did they do? Anybody remember? In December of I want to say it was 1989 maybe? No. Yeah, 1994, they went and did a change in their pricing model. They went from hourly rate to $19.95 unlimited. Now imagine that. You're an ISP, right? You want to keep up. You have to do something to differentiate yourself. I worked with several of these ISPs in Pensacola, and I told them, you have to do something different. You can't change your pricing. They all said, we're going to change our pricing to $19.95 unlimited. Well, at this point in time, I had put a server in one of these ISPs. I was doing some work with a company called iCat, which I'll talk about in a second, and AOL came and did all of this. So at the same time, Netscape had become the de facto standard for internet browsing. There were several browsers that came out before this, but this was the big one. At the same time, when I was building my remote backup service, I wanted to use 4 modems on a serial card. Well, who remembers working with DOS? What was one of the problems you had when you were putting together a DOS machine with a lot of different interface cards? IRQ problems, right? It could only handle 2 interrupts at a time, typically, because you had a parallel port, a serial port, and maybe a modem, maybe a sound card. Well, not so. This little guy on the lower left, that's the first 32-bit operating system ever written for the PC, OS/2 Warp. It was beautiful because you could spawn off 4 different DOS processes that were independent of each other, and they all could read the hardware separately. So what I did is I put my remote backup software on OS/2, ran 4 different sessions of it, hooked it up to my card, my modems ran, everything was happy, everything worked. So that worked well, but the business didn't go as well as I had hoped. So what I ended up doing was creating a company called Creative Data Concepts and partnered with this iCat Corporation. Anybody ever hear of them? They were the first e-commerce providers ever in the market. There was no standardized scripting language. There was no standardized shopping cart. These were the guys that invented it. They were based out of Seattle, and they had a CGI-based system that worked either on Windows or on Linux. You could do it either way. And they were big into marketing because they had been in the business of generating catalogs for very large corporations, and they had like 6,000 customers. So for them to get those customers and convert them to an e-commerce platform, that was a big deal. They needed businesses to do that. So I got involved with that, started hosting some things at an ISP that was located in this building in downtown Pensacola, and grew my business from there. The remote backup business didn't go very well, but the ICAP business grew like crazy until the ISP I was with started changing its pricing model and saying, we're going to offer unlimited service for $19.95. They were already behind the 8 ball because they had swapped out all of their network gear 3 times over. Their pricing model was getting them, they went from a 10-to-1 user to modem ratio on the hourly rate. Guess how low it went? Went down to 3-to-1, 3 per modem. So 3 at $19.95 a month is $60. Costs $120 a month to run that line. There's 48 of those lines. The bleeding was pretty heavy and didn't stop, okay? They were absorbed by a local CLEC at the time, a local telephone company, and I saw the writing on the wall. So I ended up getting an office in this building and started my own web hosting company. I got away from the whole idea of doing an internet service provider and went to web hosting. So I ended up being one of the first web hosting providers in the entire Southeast, actually. We opened our doors in 1998, middle of 1998, in that office building. So what we did is we ended up getting a T1 line, that was our internet connection, from a company called UUNet. I called them Screw UNet because it was the cost. Guess how much the cost for the T1 line was? It's $3,600 a month, just for one T1 line. So we got a T1 line, put in a rack of servers. These servers were HP servers. At the time, there was no such thing as a firewall. You bought a router or rented a router. You had a CSU DSU card in it. There was no Ethernet, so you had a conversion between serial and packets on the card itself. So it was a little bit slower, a lot more latency. And then inside that, you had a 10 megabit Ethernet switch. There was no VLANs, there was no layer 3 switching, none of that stuff in that network. So we set up really what basically amounted to the first web hosting company. And this is where we started to learn a lot about security, right? Even back in those days, the web hosting companies were attacked pretty readily. So in our, somebody's on my computer. So on our computers, we were using Windows NT, okay? At the time, you had to install this options pack to get IIS-4 on your Windows NT server. We chose this because this is what the ICAT software worked with. And also at the time, there was this company that used to make the basic language. Now they had, obviously, Microsoft, but they were putting out some other Office products, and one of those was FrontPage. So we saw that that was going to be an option for us to make some really quick revenue in the hosting business. And they came out with this, who remembers FrontPage? Anybody still use FrontPage? So on FrontPage, you used to have to install these extensions on IIS, right? And then people could connect to you. They would have a username and password that would connect them directly to your web server and authenticate on that web server and let them publish their website from their computer to the web server. Now, the web servers, every one of the servers on the network at this time had an internet-facing IP. NAT was invented, but it wasn't pushed out yet because there were no firewalls that supported NAT at this point in time. So even the workstations in our office were internet-facing. So everything had an internet-facing IP. There was no security. The only security you had were basically some ACLs on the firewall or on the router at the edge. So we also added SQL Server support, and I started out with 6.5. And then we found this little scripting language. Anybody ever heard of Cold Fusion? Yeah, that was really secure, wasn't it? Great language because you could develop very rapidly with it, but there was no security thought into this at all, right? I don't know how many times we had SQL injection attacks and all different kinds of things that people could figure out pretty quickly. I mean, I'm talking like in 2000, we were seeing SQL injection attacks on our databases. They were either Access or SQL Server on these Cold Fusion websites. So we learned really quickly how to parameterize our queries, do all that sort of thing. Well, we also adopted one of the first coding methodologies called Fusebox. Anybody's heard of that? That's a pretty unique way. It's basically the whole MVC model has been broken down. It's what developed into the MVC model initially. So we were humming along until about 2001. I was meeting with some executives from Visit Florida, and we were going to be doing some work for them, and then this happened. And this is really when, in my mind, security became on everybody's radar, right? Physical security, but also network security, right? Because at this point, what are the three things we talk about in security? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? Well, this just wiped out A completely for everybody in those buildings, right? Availability was gone, done, finished. So in our realm, we started to see people wanting many, many more things. Well, what are you doing to protect your servers? What are you doing to protect our network? How is our data being backed up? What are you doing with that data? This is where we started to get a lot of questions about not only how do I host my website, but how do I host my website and do it safely and keep it secure? So the business kept growing, kept going well. We started implementing some other things. We did get the business from them. I ended up getting married in 2001, adopted 2 boys. Things were going well until about 2004. And this little guy came along. His name was Ivan. Ivan hit on Wednesday, I want to say it was September 14th. 135-mile-an-hour winds pounded the Gulf Coast for 14 hours straight. This is one of the worst hurricanes that ever hit the Gulf Coast. Not a big deal, right, you would think. Well, problem was, in our business, people didn't really care much about you being in a data center and being up all the time. So we didn't have redundant power, we didn't have anything other than battery backups on our machines. And if you look at that bridge on the left, that's the I-10 bridge over Escambia Bay in Escambia County. There's a truck there that you can see. That truck drove by the hotel we were sheltering in at about 2:45 in the morning. He ran off that bridge and didn't know it wasn't there, and he didn't survive that fall. But this is what happened after Ivan. This is downtown Pensacola. That's the harbor near the pass. My office is at the time, our building, our data center is up the street here a little ways. So we didn't get a whole lot of damage. We're on the 3rd floor, but we didn't have any power. We were without power for over 17 days in downtown Pensacola. And this over here on this side, that was my house. So the front door, this is where the front door is here. That's 7 feet above sea level. The water was up there. That was water coming out of the sound. So everybody along the Gulf Coast that was anywhere near the edge of the water, their house was gone. It was devastated. It was an amazing event. So that got us to the point where I'm rebuilding, trying to find a house to live in, trying to get my family back together. I'm also president of one of the local chambers, helping them. But we're also getting customers saying, what are you doing? What's your plan? How are you going to fix this? How are you going to make sure this never happens again? So we were fortunate that across the hall from us, Sprint had built a data center. They built that data center back in '85. They were the telephone provider for Pensacola for AOL, CompuServe, and a whole bunch of other smaller networks. They abandoned that because long distance became so cheap they could do it centrally in bigger cities and not have to pay for their smaller outposts. They just left it. They just left this whole data center there. So we took over that data center, made an agreement with the landlord, converted it into a server-based data center, bought a generator, put in fiber rings, put in high-speed internet. At the time, we were OC3, 2 OC3 connections to the data center. That's since been upgraded to full 1 gig connections, and when I go back next week, we'll be upgrading full to 10 gig connections to that data center. But that gave us the ability to increase our redundancy and increase our reliability and availability way beyond what we had done before. So that helped us keep customers, helped us gain new business. Problem was, web hosting then at that point became a commodity, so we had to adapt again. And what we ended up doing was we formed a new company. AppRiver came into being in 2002. In 2006, they saw an opportunity to help my company. And what we did is we started going out to these businesses that had been impacted by the hurricane and putting fiber into their building and leading them back to our data center. This gave them the ability to be in our data center, to have the uptime for their servers. We could feed them internet over that connection, and that gave them some assurance. And that was all well and good until 8, 9 years went down the road and there were no hurricanes, right? People are paying $1,500, $2,000 a month for their internet and data center. Why am I doing this? Well, now we know, right? It came back around this year. But things like that are cyclic. So we were able to do this with VMware and some other things, helping these customers grow their business. We were able to add some security. The company merged with AppRiver, got absorbed into AppRiver. I went on to their engineering team, And then we started, got thrown into doing data center changes for for AppRiver. So what we ended up doing, we were at one point, we were Rackspace's largest customer. The only one that was bigger than us now, or before we started to move, was EA Sports. Now we're not so much a big customer with with Rackspace, but we've moved everything to Equinix data centers that we manage on our own. So the point is here, not what we did, but it's the skills that I had to develop to be able to do this, right? Remember, I went from being a microbiologist to somebody that's now moving servers in data centers around the world for a company that has 10 million mailboxes that they're filtering. So that's the change in that time frame for what I've been doing. So how did I get involved in InfoSec? Well, in 2013, I was encouraged to attend DEF CON by our CTO. I went and was like, holy shit, this place is weird. There's some strange stuff here. Yeah, I've come to accept most of it now, and I get it. At the time, I didn't, and that was my mistake, going to a conference that large before I went to something smaller, more intimate like this. So anyway, next year, I went to DEF CON again. 2015, somebody told me about this little conference called B-Sides in Las Vegas. So I showed up there, and I said, how much does it cost? They go, well, it's free. I said, what's the catch? Oh, you just have to get in line to get a badge. Okay, got in line, got a badge, went to this conference. It was cool. But I had also gone to NOLACon that year, and I met a guy named Ben Miller. I don't know if anybody knows Ben. And he gave me 2 pieces of advice. He said, get your CISSP and get to know Jack Daniel. So that year at NOLACon, or at B-Sides, I met Jack. He probably doesn't remember at this point. And then worked on my CISSP and passed that last summer. But since I've gone to DEF CON every year, I'm now, I went to NOLACon in 2016 and spoke, and that gave me that was the first time I ever spoke at a conference. From there, I then applied to do the Proving Ground at B-Sides in 2016, which I got accepted, had Dave Lewis as my mentor, and met this guy up here in the vest here. Sciatic nerd. Good guy, by the way. Get to meet him. He's a great guy. And got to speak at B-Sides. From there, I went on and applied to speak at some other conferences. Basically, what I was doing was sharing information about what we did at AppRiver and how we did it. Met this crazy guy, Leonard, over here in this Graylog company, and I used his tools and learned some things from him and learned from other people and gotten to meet literally hundreds of people in the process, right? So in this year, I was fortunate enough to be able to speak at DEF CON. So the point is, it's not what I've done, but it's how I've gotten from being a microbiologist, a biologist, to getting involved in InfoSec, right? So if you're in that path, anywhere in that path, you can do it. You don't have to be somebody that has a degree in InfoSec. You don't have to be somebody that follows a certain path that somebody else follows, right? If you're motivated, right, if you want to learn, there's plenty of people out there to help you. There's plenty of great people that know tons more than I do. I just suck up to them and learn from them, right? So, yeah. So now when I go back, this is the next phase, right? 2014, 2017, we took this old building where my office was in downtown Pensacola. It was on the 3rd floor above this. It was 10,000 square feet in this building. We've turned it from this into this, which is probably a state-of-the-art co-work space, probably not one nicer in the entire Southeast. And what we've done, we've wired it up with 10 gig connectivity all throughout. There's 20 gigs of internet on the wireless through the place. Pretty phenomenal, right? So if you would ask me, would I be doing this in what would I be doing in 2017? When I was in high school, I would have said, probably out taking care of cats, dogs, horses, and pigs somewhere, right? Now, here's what I've been doing. This is another view of the building, another view of the location there. And this is my next project. When I get back, I have to move an entire data center from the space it is now over to this. That Sprint data center, they're tearing that building apart and putting in a hotel, so I have to move the whole thing. So that's my next challenge. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do it, but I have complete confidence that I will get it done. Uh-oh. And I guess the moral of the story is, I don't know if you've seen the Back to the Future where they pull the note out of the pocket and Doc reads the note, right? And she goes, well, where's the writing on that note? And Doc says, your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it, so go out and make it a good one. And I guess the moral of the story is you can do whatever you want to do. All the stuff you hear on Twitter about having a degree, not having a degree, take that time that you would waste listening to that and doing all that crap, pick up a book, do something useful, and make yourself better, right? And become part of the solution, not part of the problem. Become one of those people that contributes. There's a lot of people in this room that I know that really contribute a whole lot to the community, and that's really what it's all about, right? We all have to get along. We heard the keynote on Friday, right? Why are we mean to each other? Why do we do these things? We all have our expertise. We are all very good at what we do. We can all work together to make the community better and make the world safer. So that's all I've got. But if you need to get a hold, oh, I had to get the cat picture in there. So I don't know if the cat dressed up like Buzz Lightyear. So there you go. What a long, strange trip it's been. If I would have thought back to my life, how I got to this point, I never would have planned it like that. So you never know what life's going to hand you. So when it does, take it and run with it. Appreciate your time. Thanks for coming out. I stole a minute back from you. Nice to meet you. How you doing? Oh, cool, yeah. Yep. So one of the things I didn't talk about, but that'd be a whole different talk, would be all the time sunk into creating programs, and thanks, appreciate it. And it doesn't exist. It's gone. Millions and millions of programming hours, right? And that was kind of I didn't want to get into it even with the DOS stuff, right? So the mistake that people make is that they think the market can handle thousands of different things that do the same thing, right? It never worked. You have a card? Let me get out of here so the next speaker can get up here, and then we can chat if you want to. So what do you do now? Oh, wow. Cool. Is that where you're based now still? Georgia. What part of Georgia? Oh, wow. Thank you, Steve. So it was all right?
Oh, it's underneath? Let me get plugged in.
Nah,
I don't see shit.
we got one mic.
Okay. Power? Power? Oh, there.
There's Ryan in the back.
Okay.
Oh, it's pretty good for 5.
System check. Oh, this mic's got a cord. Okay, that's not going to work. training. You think? Can we?
Do not trip on the cable.
Yeah, you're into a mixer right there, so that's your limit.
That's as far as I go. Like this.
Go down. And then come back up. It's a little bit more. So, now.
Oh, managed. Good job, John. So I can go as far as here. Okay, not bad. Alright. Okay, that's all I got. You're killing me, Pete. Somebody tell a joke. I guess that's my job. Yeah, what happened to him? Thanks, Lee. Knew I could depend on you. Okay. Only if I walk like this, right?
He's going to trip on it. I know it's going to happen.
This is an SM58. It makes me feel like the rock star days, right? I was in a big hair band once. Something happened. Seriously, I sent a picture around to the guy. Didn't I send you guys a picture? Long hair?
No. You've got it?
Yeah.
How come I don't have it? That's cool.
Because you don't read your email, John.
Is that right?
Seriously, I had it down to the belt, like this, right? And then life happened. What time is it? Are you guys just going to give us a signal? We're good? Okay. Oh, hey. Isn't DerbyCon awesome? It feels like home. I just love it. Come on. Hey. All right, I'm gonna start out by telling a quick story. First of all, my name's Joff, okay? This guy. I work at Black Hills, Security Weekly co-host, and other annoying IT guy. The story is a little briefly how I got involved in InfoSec, and it goes back about 10 years, actually. And it is Mike Poor's fault. Okay, anybody who knows Mike Poor. I actually once took Sec 503, I don't know if anybody taken that SANS class, right? And Mike was there, and we're talking about packet fragmentation, and so while I'm in the class, I start writing a covert channel tool immediately, right? Hey, who broke my laptop? All right, hold on. Yeah, okay. Hey guys, it's good here. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Deploy countermeasures. Deploy countermeasures.
Contain!
Take one for the team. AV guys, we need help. We need help.
Where's the cave? Shoot up. I knew you would have that many. I just knew it. I had to come prepared. I thought I was prepared. Show what he has.
Okay, I got a problem. And no, it's not personal.
Here, John, you just talk.
Okay, so let me finish the joke. It's 2007, I come fresh out of Sec 503, and I am full of Packet Ninja, right? And I come back to work. At that time, I worked for a large public university, and somebody hit play on that. Okay. And my chief information security officer at the time, he says, Joff, I want to put you on an interview committee, and we're going to interview this candidate that's coming over. She's federal government, and we'll call her Jane, just for the sake of the joke, right? So the interview's going really well. She's really eager. She's looking good. We're like, oh man, this is going to be a great candidate. So I'm like, my boss at the time, Chuck, I got to ask a question. Jesus. Okay. I said, do you mind if I, ask the candidate a question? And Chuck's like, yeah, sure, go ahead. I said, okay, well, Jane, you probably might want to be sitting down for this question. I said, can you tell me what the leftmost bit of the 6th offset of the IP header is? And can you tell me which RFC refers to it, what year, month, day, and for extra credit, can you write a TCP dump filter for it? Okay? And we hear this long pause and some heavy breathing at the other end of the phone. And then it was just click. And she never called back. Okay? And my boss at the time said, that is the last time you are sitting on my interview committee. Right? So I was full of vim and vigor from Sec 503, and I took Sec 504 from Ed Scotus. And I think a lot of you probably relate to this. I got seriously hooked, okay? And I decided right then and there that I was going to leave the world of public education. For those who have been in it, it can be painful at times. And the only thing that happened was a small economic recession that kind of delayed my plans, okay? So that's how it happened. Okay, now back to the presentation that's not working. My name is Joff Thayer. I'm Security Weekly co-host. I'm also a Black Hills Information Security employee. I actually pen test for a living most of the time. I write some software. This is my good friend, Pete Peterson. Okay? Hey. Pete is one of our best customers. And who had this idea, Pete?
I believe it was mine.
Okay, Pete said, can we present together? I said, absolutely. This is going to be fun, right? Pete, I won't give too much away because you'll see it in the presentation if it actually works. Pete has a very well-defended network, and we have evolved together over time to be something that is a unique relationship that we really, really enjoy. And that's really what this presentation is going to be about, if we can get it working.
We're on it. Just keep on.
Okay.
Your next slide
My next slide,
is going to be titled,
agenda.
What is cybersecurity, everybody? Oh,
Okay.
God.
Okay, I'm going to hand the mic to Pete then. We're going to miss the agenda, and we're going to talk about what is cybersecurity. So let Pete talk a little bit, and we'll try to get this thing together.
I'm going to now look at my slide. So the way this started for me was back in 2013, and we got a regulatory request into my company, and it was talking all about cybersecurity. And in the request, it kept talking cyber, cyber, cyber. And I went to the Google, and I Googled cyber to find out what it was. And cybersecurity is? Show of hands, yes? No? It's mostly maybe. So what I decided to do first was kind of like go I have a philosophy degree, so I took the approach that was very philosophical in nature and very deep. So if you want to study some kind of process philosophically that's got to do with strategy and defense, who are you going to go to? Sun Tzu, right? And Sun Tzu led me to other books, like the Book of the Five Rings. Anybody read the Book of the Five Rings? Lots of yeses. 33 Strategies of War. Crickets. It was my son's bedtime stories. But I knew before I got started that the very first thing I'd have to do is I'd have to get complete and utter management buy-in to do the types of things and impose the kind of inconveniences that I knew I was going to have to do, and to suffer the kind of personal reputational damage that implementing these controls was going to do. I knew what the cost was before I started. So ultimately what I decided to do was like fixing everything was kind of impossible. So then the strategy was how to decide how much to fix and what to fix. And as a manager, CISO, I decided to have to define what done looks like, right? So in cyber, how do you know when you're done? You got to be done sometime, right? So I decided that the thing that I need to protect the most, my crown jewels, was the firm's reputation, right? So if the firm's reputation is at stake, I decided that as long as I had done everything that any one of you or any expert could say is the right thing to do, if I took that approach, that if I was ever on the stand having to defend myself, I could make that claim. And if I could make that claim, then all good, right? I could at least get fired proudly. So this is kind of where we are. So I kind of got volunteered into the role of the CISO, and research, how do you do cybersecurity? And most importantly, how do you find who to trust for that advice, right? So how do you develop the circle of trust? It's kind of like the first evolution that you need to solve for, right? Because there are people that you should and there are people that you shouldn't. There are experts that have expert advice and there are experts that have less than expert advice. And not knowing anything, how do I decide? So I had to really develop that. So what I found that seemed in my cyber research that cyber seemed to pretty much equate to the SANS 20 critical controls. So I figured, okay, SANS seems like a bunch of good people that I trust. They have a lot of information in the public domain. So I decided that my interests were going to be best served by those that were serving the public good. And if I can find those individuals, those were going to be the ones that I wanted to base my foundation on. So obviously, SANS led me to SANS instructors. Strands instructors led me to BHIS, John Strand, and everybody else. That then led me into the world of podcasting, and that's where I started hearing John and Joff talk about issues that mattered, that were resonating with me. So that's how I got started with them. But then there's another problem. Once you decide that you're going to do this cybersecurity thing, there's this issue. And I didn't really understand this issue until I was on a sales call with John. I don't know if he remembers this because it was very brief. And I'm like, hey, I want to do pen test. He goes, you sure? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, you know, sometimes we find things during our pen test that you're going to have to deal with. So if during the engagement I ever ask you for somebody's phone number, just give it to me. So what I got at that in my role as deciding whether to do this engagement or not was, hey, there's a very real risk that there is already an existing badness in my domain because having researched this stuff, I realized I was not doing enough for years and years and years, and if it was there, I would not know. So I was thinking 60% probability of pwned, right? And I had to decide that I wanted to know that, right? And then the decision is really this. I want to protect everybody. I'm charged with protecting everybody. But in the process, what if I have to get into a disclosure issue, right? And then that is what does the damage, right? Think about that. Somebody's making that call. So evidently, I decided to take the red pill. This is just a little bit more to do with listening to the podcasts and my evolution and understanding of the things that matter. And then deciding, I think somehow I could develop a program philosophically that can defend badness and stop all the things that are bad. Then finally I kind of figured that I didn't have that ability. I didn't have the knowledge, and I needed people that did have the knowledge to help bring me along so I could design my defenses appropriately. So after having decided to do this type of engagement, I went into my management, into the boardroom, and I said, look, I laid it on the line. I said, look, I haven't been doing this security thing right for years and years and years. We're about to try and do it right, and these are the real implications. Are we in? And then I further said, is like, if we find something, I just want you to know, and I have to go to the FBI or whatever, legal, I'm going. Are you coming with me? I was not going to give them the opportunity to say don't go or not do disclosure. And they kind of said, we're on board with that. We want to do the right thing by our customers. So when you're deciding how to do these things, I really decided that when making that decision, I wanted to do the things that my customers wanted me to do in the event that that ever conflicted with business objectives. And again, I'll cut this short, but basically, that's what I just talked about. It's like beginning to know enough that I didn't know enough, and that there are implications to engaging on these cyber activities. So ultimately, I didn't know it yet, but turns out PowerShell was a threat.
All right, thanks, Pete. What a great introduction. So, yeah. So we started engaging with Pete in formal engagements as a penetration testing customer. Now, it's important for me to note that Pete didn't just engage with Black Hills. Pete has engaged with many companies represented in this room, and Pete has truly embraced the information security community to its fullest extent. And we're so proud of you, man. That's awesome. Right? Yeah, it's well deserved. So here's what we did. This is over a period of about 3 or 4 years. We had 6 diverse engagements over this period with Pete, and each was progressively more challenging for all of us. Okay, Pete included, right? Lots of fun was had because, well, sometimes I wake up and pinch myself. They pay me to do this? It's awesome, right? First engagement, laying the baseline, right? Just like any good penetration testing company, you don't want to give it all out at once. The customer, Pete in this case, needs to get slowly ramped up, have a little taste of the fun. We don't want to go straight into full red team mode, right? It could get ugly if we did that. It could get really bad, right? So we laid the groundwork. We had Pete consume a sanitized report. Redaction's really hard, by the way. Okay? We did a top 20 security controls assessment, right? It's a really good way to start now CI security, right? By getting that baseline established, doing that in a formal sense so that we know where Pete's at, so he has a vehicle he can grow upon as he moves forward through his engagement with us and everybody else, right? So what did Pete learn? Oh, before I go there, we also did a C2 pivot engagement. Now, this is one of our offerings where we do a scientific test of C2 channels that we can establish and lateral movement that we can actually get in that environment.
And at that point, it turns out that,
Yeah, we shredded Pete.
it was great.
Okay. So Pete had a baseline, and Pete learned that, yes, we can hack you. Okay? So we moved on from there.
It took about a minute.
Took about a minute. Yeah. Yeah, right. Also, do credit to all the Black Hills team, right? It's not just me doing this, okay? All right. Engagement 2, more groundwork. So a lot of people come to the realization, hey, is my network actually properly secured, right? It just so happens that in this case, this is me because I have an enormous networking background from the past, building very large networks. And yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's my boss, by the way. Anyway, so we engaged with Pete and we said, look, Pete, we're going to do a network infrastructure review. We're going to kick all of your switches, routers, firewalls, security appliances, etc., and look at it from a configuration perspective. We're going to find things like route protocol peering that is not authenticated, things like SNMP v1, just say no, right? Things like, well, are you even segmented at all? Turns out he wasn't. Things like, hey, do you have control plane protections? Can you mitigate against a complete UDP fragmented packet denial of service? Turns out he couldn't, right? Do you have DNS risk mitigation? Are you running things like split DNS? So it was very infrastructure focused. We found a lot of things, and I'm really, really OCD when it comes about this stuff. The report was like 3 miles long, okay? And Pete's like, wow, dude. And what was your immediate response to that, Pete? Okay. So, I believe Pete understood the value of segmentation very quickly. Okay?
I was literally speechless when I saw the report and all the badness that could happen just from the switches and routers.
Exactly. Okay? So that was fun, laying more groundwork. At this point, we went to engagement 3, roughly. Note this is over several years, right? We thought, it really is time to, open up the throttle a little bit, right? Yes, exactly. Well, John just made a really good point. That's because Pete had been shredded a couple of times by us, and he suddenly started putting some really good defenses in place. I mean, Pete really got better, right? So we thought, let's open the throttle. Want to make a comment?
Yeah, the one thing I want to say is at this point, that's probably like the 3rd or 4th pen test, plus there's other engagements with guys like Rob Fuller, McDouglas, everybody else, and each one of them did serious damage to me, and what I like to think to do, as soon as I got that report back, I did something about it. And the thing that And the crazy thing that I did is, at one point I watched this podcast. It was called Spartan Up or something like that. So I figured what we do is we train like Spartans, right? And we'd keep hitting ourselves in the face until we didn't feel it anymore. So there were several really talented people pen testing me all the time. Every single one of them, I got better, I learned, I did something about it. But even scarier was I scheduled the next test immediately, right? And I made a promise to my management that the way that you were going to measure me and my performance was if the same thing shows up twice, fire me.
Wow. That is some pure honesty right there, okay? So, we did another C2 pivot with Pete, right? But he had increased his defenses. He had improved markedly from the first attempts, and Pete came through that looking a lot better, right? It was really, really good. Right?
I got down to medium high.
Yeah, he got down to medium high, right? Proud moment, really proud moment, right? We did some external network and web app testing, so we got a little more focused, a little more pointed with some things as we started to evolve up, right? Now, here's the interesting thing. I wanted to throw this in because it was awfully fun. Pete had this fat pipe NVPN appliance, and he said, Joff, I'm really a little nervous about the way this management client works. I have a bad feeling about it. Can you take a look for me? Okay? I'm like, okay, yeah, that sounds like fun because like little, interesting projects where we really dig in, I love those.
It wasn't pivoting anywhere, so.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Whoa, there it is. I wasn't pivoting anywhere. I had to have something to do, right? Okay. So I downloaded the Java applet, and I started running it to log into this thing. And the first thing I noticed was the TCP traffic. I cranked up a sniffer, and it was like synac, ack, and then push ack, and 16 bytes came back immediately. I'm like, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. What the heck is this thing, right? More to the point, 16 bytes exactly came back as soon as I connected to the server. This smells like a block cipher. Wow. What am I going to do about this? Dig deeper. Okay? So I decompiled the thing. Why not, right? JD GUI, away we go. Guess what? I found a little routine in there called first time read. And if you look right about here, twofish algorithm.make key with a static 16 bytes. I'm like, wow. I literally jumped up and down, screamed. My wife goes, you all right? Oh, yeah, you just pwned something, didn't you? Called John Strand. I literally called John Strand. I said, oh, I'm going to bust this thing wide open.
Jump, it's 3 a.m.
Yeah. Right. I am so going to bust this thing wide open, right?
At which point he calls me and he goes, you got to sit down.
Right? Next slide. Turns out this thing was running in codebook mode, okay? This is the guy that coded it up here. Here's all my ideas. We're going to put a static key in the code. And this guy down here is going, hey, dude, have you ever heard of key exchange algorithms? Right? Right? Even worse, it was rekeying the cipher with subsequent blocks. Every next transaction was 32 bytes, and the latter half of the 16 bytes was a new key. I'm like, oh, I am so going to screw this thing over, right? Don't rekey the cipher with blocks from the server. Come on. Right? Out comes the Python. You do know I teach the Python class at SANS, right? So out comes the Python. Look at this key here. It is that static key. It's the same one from the source code. Okay? A quick proof of concept with the twofish algorithm. And what do I get? Plain text. Okay? So what do I do next? Of course, this happened over hours, right? I'm sitting here making it look easy, right? But I was sweating for a while, right? What do I do next? Well, I turn this same script into a script that can just read a PCAP. Read the PCAP, decrypt the traffic. Awesome. So we contacted the vendor. And after we had Pete sit down, we're like, Pete, I think we have to do a coordinated disclosure, right? And I called John. I was like, how do we do this? I'm not good at this stuff. It took him 3 months, right? And after the 3 months, I think we got sort of the angry email, like, after we webcast it, like, you guys just busted on our stuff. And we're like, yeah, we tried to call you, right? We tried to call you. So I think 90 days is fair, right? So yeah, so they since have remediated, and we offered them a pen test, and they didn't seem to be very interested, which I just don't get that, right? All right, engagement 4 was a departure into threat hunting. Invoke countermeasures. Invoke countermeasures. Countermeasures. We prepared. Oh, this is beautiful. They are attacking back. By the way, this can get you arrested.
See, this crap is what happens when you pit vendors against each other.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, we do love Dave.
I'm a blue teamer!
Yes, look, demonstrated, right?
Didn't see it coming.
Pete for the win. Uh-oh. Okay. We're really up here to talk about serious stuff. Good job, guys. Good job. Hat.
Binary defense, ladies and
Binary defense. Thank you, guys. So at this point, Black Hills had a thing going we called Rita. You guys may have heard of it. John talked about it in the keynote. John's taking one for the team. Thank you. Okay? See, that's the kind of boss I have. He's fired me 3 times this week already. All right, so...
Did you hear that quote?
No, I didn't hear that quote.
He said it's warm and it smells like ass.
Right. Ass key, right? Because he just broke the HR policies that we have. Okay. Did we have those? Anyway, I've totally lost track of this. We did this thing called threat hunting, okay? And Black Hills for a while has been developing threat hunting techniques because we sort of have a sense of responsibility. Wow, right? So Rita's a whole story unto itself. I don't need to tell it here, but we used the alpha release of the Rita code with Pete, had a threat hunting engagement, and this was Pete's quote. I actually asked Pete to write me back, can you tell me something you learned out of this, right? And Pete was kind enough to do that, right? So Pete, you could read your own quote, or...
The most valuable part of this threat hunting engagement is basically baselining absolutely everything, understanding all of the comms in and out of your network, everything that is weird. And believe me, when you start doing this initially, everything looks horrible. You don't know what to think. You have to isolate everything, predetermine, and then go through a whitelisting phase. But the exercise was so valuable because at the least, I now knew what my entire network was doing.
There it is, from the mouth. All right, so there you go. From Pete's mouth, that is. Okay, that was fun. So we went engagement 5, twist and turn. Pete had implemented BDS Vision, a fine product, fine gentleman here in the front row, right? But we wanted to break it. It's like, why not break it? Whenever you want, John. So we invoked Bo Bullock. We have a PowerShell script called invoke Bo as well. And Bo, yeah, it's great. He just appears. It's awesome. Epic red beard and all, right? Bo busts on BDS Vision, right? Dave's crew, really props here, fixed it within 10 hours, okay?
I want to talk to this just a little bit. Yesterday in my presentation, I was talking about vendors that are kind of crappy to work with. They threaten you with lawsuits. They threaten to beat you up. They get angry. They deny absolutely everything. When we talked to Dave and the BDS crew, Dave is like, we're on it. And usually we expect like a month, right? So it was actually less than 10 hours. I think it was fixed in less than 10 hours. BDS actually got it to the customer in 10 hours. So less than half a day, it was fixed. So it was awesome.
10 hours is actually the metric in which it was fully redeployed in my entire enterprise, by the way.
And Dave, did Dave do most of the coding to actually fix it? Or do you guys know who worked on it? I don't think Dave slept. So hats off to that guy right back there. And that's kind of the point of this. Vendors working with each other is the best place to progress. So that's just what I want to say. And by the way,
thank you, John.
One more thing that I want to say that's super, super important here is every time I asked to hack Vision, they said, bring it, let's do it, let's get better. They never denied a single request. That's why it's evolving so fast.
That is awesome. Okay, now let me show you just a few of the details. That happened. So Bo up here did a little test, right, of a little PowerShell script, and he thought he decided to get some cross-site scripting into the alert, and meanwhile on the Vision console, whoops, a little suboptimal, right? And that was one of the things that happened, but we really don't have time to go into all of it. So now we come to engagement 6. How am I doing on time, Pete?
You have time.
Excellent. So engagement 6 And I skipped a few details in between, I'll be honest with you. But this happened this year, okay? We decided Pete had matured well enough over the 3 years, and Pete concurred that it was time for some red teaming. Mick's crying in the front row. Okay? So, red teaming is got a really wide definition amongst pen testing companies. Everybody sort of has a different way of looking at it and doing it, and it's really one of those things that you have to be super creative, and it's context specific, and it takes talent and time, and so we teamed up employee number 1 at Black Hills, which is Ethan Robish. Ethan's a little bit shy. He doesn't appear in public too often. But Ethan is awesome. Okay? So Ethan Robish and it was me decided to do this one. And we were thinking, our biggest thing here is we just want to get on-prem, right? But before we go there, I want to talk about some of the things that I was thinking and some of the things that Pete was thinking as we were leading up to this. My thoughts were like this. We've worked with Pete for a few years. He has really tightly managed desktops. I mean, these things were locked down, okay? Fully deployed and well deployed app locker, okay? GPO managed controls. You could not pop a cmd.exe in his environment. You could not pop a PowerShell prompt in his environment, okay? Well-segmented network. He learned, right? Learned well, right? So we kind of wanted a smash and grab approach because we just had to get in there. But then the question was, what are we going to use? He's app-locked the hell out of everything. We can't have a custom exe or custom DLL, stuff like that. How are we going to get there? All right? So here's some of Pete's thoughts. Pete just reminded me of something. He did his app locker policy so well that there were parts of Microsoft that he blacklisted. Okay? Yeah. Right? He was not mucking around. Okay? Here's Pete to talk about some of his thoughts as we went into this.
So I kind of knew Joff at that point. We've been working together for 3 years. I knew the capabilities of Black Hills, and I knew I really, really wanted to win. And if you're defending against Black Hills, you have to alter your definition of win. I knew that they were going to try some vile phishing attacks. I knew how you had to really amp up my defense on the spam, so I stopped delivering email.
He's not kidding.
I'm really not kidding. They didn't get through, did they?
No, he stopped delivering email. I called him one day and I said, Pete, do you deliver any email at all?
I told him email was bad. So I knew that a few things about that, so I tried to not deliver the spam. I knew the attackers from listening to social engineering podcasts and other people that they were going to get into my premises and they were going to do stuff. But the question was, what would they do and how fast could I catch them? Because I know that they were going to smash and grab. So I was thinking I only had a couple of minutes to contain them and eradicate them. So we're talking full-blown red team. The goal was under 2 minutes to get them. But the real problem with this is when you're subjected to a red team engagement, you kind of say, go. So you get it, right? It's not like pen testing, which is like, hey, hack me now. Did you see it? No. This is like, I don't know if I'm seeing it. I don't know if my alerts are working. All you hear is silence.
He was so paranoid. I called him a couple of times. He's, dude, when are you coming? When are you coming? What's going on? Like, I'm freaking out. Right.
It's a true story. After about 3 weeks of this, I had to go down to Jim McMurray's office, and I'm like, Jim, I think I failed miserably.
BBS, where are you?
I think after the 5th attempt, if you're going to get pwned, do it your way.
That's not bad.
I like it. But then the big problem was, like, I've seen videos of people walking around with USB sticks once they get on the premise, and I figured I couldn't let that happen. But I knew it was going to happen, so we had to do something to stop that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit.
All right, we're getting a little short on time, so I'm going to keep going. All right. So we did some recon, and we camped out in a little coffee shop at the building that Pete worked in. I'm trying to sound relatively anonymous, and no attribution here, right? So we did a little bit of recon. Ethan and I sitting there having coffee, cool little coffee shop, and we were like, you know, Pete's, I'll admit this much, Pete, hope you don't mind. Pete's in the financial industry, and his employees were likely Asians in their mid to late 30s, right?
That is true.
That is true. So Ethan and I came across this brilliant thing. So I said, look, Ethan, here's the deal. I'm going to go sit in the car with my laptop watching for shells, and you are going to intercept the first likely looking group and get in the elevator and go.
I didn't want the shell to happen, by the way.
Yeah.
That was his choice.
It was my choice, right? Okay, so I had a little bit of a problem, though. I knew that Pete was app locked up and down, and I was like, how am I going to write a piece of software to get around Pete, basically, right? How am I going to do this, right? We went up there. Ethan did. Right, did I skip a slide? Hold on. Oh, no, he did. We ran up there, and this is the thing we also absolutely did not anticipate. Ethan ran up there with my piece of software, which I'll talk about in a minute, plugged in a Bash Bunny. Immediately it failed. Okay? So it's like, oh, crap. Grabbed his backup USB stick, and it failed as well. Okay? Turns out, shout out to Milton Security, that Pete,
USB Informer
had deployed USB Informer, and there was going to be no USB key that was going to work. Okay? Good job, Jim. Jim Milton Security. What do we do now? Ethan is, well, in a highly anxiety state and going, oh crap, to me with text messages, right? There were some tense SMS moments. So this may not be very readable, but up here Ethan says, can you start up a web server and send me the IP? And I'm sitting there going, I can be a very literal guy sometimes. I'm like, what does he want a web server for? Why don't the USB work? Dude, what's going on, right? He says, okay. I said, stand by. Here's the IP address. That's our Nginx box. You know, it was like a DigitalOcean box or something like that, right? He's like, path. I was like, just root. He goes, I only see index.html. I was like, what else do you want? You said a web server, right? He goes, I need the DLL and the payload. Oh, I see.
It's like that.
It was my fault, right? Okay, yeah, I got you. Okay, it's not working. He's like, what about a Python web server? Oh, yeah. What's the payload name? I'm like, I'm being a little slow, right? I'm like, okay. I'm like, hit it again, dude. It's Python now. And I actually put the payloads up there, right? Ethan downloads it. The next text I send, shell. That was a nice moment, right? So I immediately start exfiltrating as much data as I can using ADSI and LDAP inside of Meterpreter, right? Inside of Metasploit, okay? Because I'm like, I want proof, right? That I'm there. We were so excited to get one shell out of this environment, okay? That's not normal. He's quite abnormal, Okay? Now, it turned out 2 weeks before that, Sub T, if Casey's in the room, I love his work, okay? He dropped a blog post about RegServe32, which registers DLLs in the operating system when installations occur. I'm like, holy crap.
That was just 2 weeks before my test.
2 weeks before the test. I'm like, Casey, if you're anywhere here, I could kiss you for that, right? But I won't. So I'm like, I so could use that. I'm like, break out Visual Studio and start writing some code. It turns out that there's an install routine that RegServe32 leverages that I could turn into a shellcode delivery mechanism. He outlined the code for me. I just finished the job. So I broke out Visual Studio and I wrote a piece of code that not only could deliver shellcode either from a base64 encoded file or a URL, and it could also run PowerShell scripts. It's a sweet piece of code, right? And we had to explain how we did that to Binary Defense afterwards. Mick literally called us on the phone. He's like, what the guys? And I was like, oh, snickering. Ooh, yeah, I got you. They did. They had it fixed relatively quickly, right? Not just a quick note, Pete, before you go. I went ahead and released this. I didn't know what to call it, so it's called Weavade. I'm terrible at naming projects. Okay? Here, Pete, your comments.
Just real quick, on that note, when they did the RegServer command and RegServer made comms outside, Vision popped it, like immediately. So high five for Vision, that was amazing. I had a cleaned alert with Intel enriched from the SOC in my inbox within 90 seconds of that happening. Yay?
Yeah. Awesome, right? But we got shell.
How long did the shell last?
The shell lasted around about 60 seconds, I believe. I also love this tweet back here from, text from Ethan, right? Oh, you got shell. Excellent. I'm going to see Pete. Because that was the ask, like, you got to let us in now so we can screw around with your environment on the inside, right? Awesome. Okay. When we got in, said, hey, I had some special extra countermeasures prepared for you guys. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. He goes, no, check this out. He walked us into one of his data center rooms, and he had fisheye lenses hooked up to homemade solution that actually sent him text and pictures to every security employee's phone. So anything moved in that room, all his people knew it.
It turns out it doesn't matter what they do outside the room, only when they're standing in front of your computers.
Really pretty cool. I'm like, dude. He thought about also propping up a hat or something, wasn't it, on a can of Foster's, so he thought that would be my honeypot. But I told him later that, have you ever wondered why Australia exports that crap?
I didn't know. That's where I didn't do my intel.
He didn't do his recon, right? All right. Pete, I'm going to let you talk to this. We're going to do a little bit of lessons learned and then wrap it up.
So this chart is super important. This is the design of my overall program that accomplished the defenses against the red team. This is not my chart. This was given to me by Rob Fuller, who was one of the attackers, and I just thought it was such a sweet way to visualize how to design your controls that I just wanted to show it to you guys so that you can think about it. It also came from Adam Uccello, if anybody knows Adam. Props for this tool because it's amazing for somebody that's got to decide what controls to put in and how to put them in. This helps me understand what tools have exactly what job, right? So it's important for me to know exactly why something is in and what its job to do. And then it also helps me defend those tools, right? So if something is doing X and I know it's doing X, I need something to also protect it. And this is just a way to organize that. I wish I had time to explain it and go through what everything is doing and what it is doing. But I'll tell you the things that really matter in here are, in our GPO, we've implemented the full STIG, and the machine still works, so it's possible. We did full egress filtering on the Cisco ASA. AppLocker we talked about. We used Milton Security's Edgewall, Milton Security's USB Informer to achieve some of this. You'll see Vision is deployed in several areas of this grid, performing very important tasks. Vision, again, it's solid. There's other tools that are kind of important. Triumphant has been renamed. It's owned by a company called Nehemiah. What that does is that snapshots memory every minute, and the registry every minute pumps it into a NoSQL database, so I know with reasonable assurance something is moving from a baseline. Yes?
How big is your security team versus the total number of employees?
My security team is like 0.5 FTEs. We're about 150 employees. So what I needed to do was basically leverage multiple SOCs to make this happen without growing a huge security team. So that's why, I use virtual SOCs. Milton Security is a part of that. BDS is a part of that. There are other companies that are part of that. And it's the only way that I can be successful with this is leveraging other people's expertise. I'm calling them micro SOCs or VSOCs, which each have a very specific purpose in the detection stack. And they are excellent at their part of the stack, all alerting to me. I wish there was more time. If anybody wants to drill into this, I'm happy to talk about it with you, but the most important thing is this is a tool to organize your framework and decide where you have holes. You should probably have half a dozen things in each box.
Thanks, Pete. That's awesome, right?
I picked the wrong color in Excel.
Okay. There it is. The dark green versus the light green was, oops. Okay. So, we've come a long way together. We've had a really, really good journey. To use an old cliche, it takes a village. Pete leveraged a lot of good talent in the information security community, and he took it seriously. He implemented it. He read the reports, okay? And when you read the reports and you implement stuff, you can defend yourself. And you can really frustrate people like us, right? But that's a win. Sometimes as pen testers, we get frustrated like, I don't know how many times I've called John or one of the other guys and gone, I'm not winning, this sucks. Why am I not winning? Why am I not winning? Wait. Either I'm not bringing my A game, or they really are doing it right. Okay? And in Pete's case, he's doing the right things. He's doing the right things, and he's evolving, and he's optimizing. And that is the best possible scenario, right? Right? Peter, you walking on water yet? Right? So how to optimize defenses, how we measure the optimization, right? Pete's at this point of tweaking and tuning and measuring and getting better and better. He's got some near-term goals. I'll let you speak to those.
So right now, it turns out that, as everybody knows, when you're a company in your blue team, you're buying a lot of blinky lights and you're putting them really fast and you don't really have time to figure out everything that they're doing or their full capabilities. Well, as a result of this whole, I kind of know exactly why every tool is there, and I can see in my stack, my security stack, where there's redundancies and inconveniences that aren't really buying me anything. So I'm reducing the thickness of that stack because they're fully covered. So I'm reducing the redundancies where it's not necessary.
Okay, and I know we're very short on time. From the Black Hills perspective, we have to sort of rethink. What does it actually mean to test against a sophisticated customer where I can't pop a cmd.exe, I can't pop a PowerShell.exe, I can't run vanilla exploits? They will not work, right? It is not going to be an easy day. To use another cliche, you have to think out of the box. There is no choice, right? And it has gotten to the point for me that if I test a company and it's an easy day, I actually get kind of bored. It shouldn't be that way. It should be challenging. It needs to be challenging, right? Together we made each other better. And that's the real sweet story here. We have a great relationship, and we made each other better, and that's what we love about what's happened here. It's a good story.
And almost 90% of my policies, procedures, controls, they came from what I learned over DerbyCon over the last 4 years. Every talk that I went to, this is the community's manifestation in one small enterprise, making one small difference.
And so that brings us to the end of the talk. There's the Twitter handles if you want to find us. Thanks so much for listening. We really wanted to tell this story. Thanks for coming.